Hello and welcome to this tutorial. Today I'm going to demonstrate a method, certainly not the method, but a method of using the Compositor in Blender to get a cartoon sort of cel shaded look. So to start off with, I've got my file here. I've got a model that I created and rigged, and I've put it into a pose that I think is kind of fun. And I'll show you what a render of this looks like just out of the box. So let's click on View Render and Frame All Fit. So this is actually what this renders like. It's very kind of traditional. It's a cycles render and looks sort of very not cartoony in a hand-drawn way, but cartoony in a Pixar-ish kind of way, in a Pixar DreamWorks 3D animated sort of way. So we've got our character here. He's a litter hunter, and he's kind of disgusted because he's picking up this apple, and I think it would be fun to try to make him into a Toon Shaded character. So to start off, let's close out this render here, and I've got to set up a few different settings. So first of all, under my render settings, I need to go down to the film twirl down here, and I need to check this box that says transparent. And the reason I'm going to do that is that I'm going to create a couple of view layers you can see up here in the top right. And one of them is going to handle the outlines for this project, which of course that's actually the next thing we need to do. Down here, still under our render settings, we need to check freestyle and enable that. Freestyle is a Blender feature that creates outlines that can be manipulated in kind of fun ways. So with this transparent checkbox, we're actually going to split out these layers, and we're going to be able to manipulate the line quality separately from the rest of the render. Okay, so now under our layer settings here, we need to go in and under our filters, we need to uncheck freestyle. And basically what we're doing here is we're telling this render layer, you don't include the results from the freestyle feature. So those lines are not going to show up on this render layer, which right now is just called view layer. You can click in here and name it something else if you prefer, but we're just going to leave it at that. Okay, we also need to do a few changes under light here. We need to select diffuse color. What that's going to do is in our compositor, that's going to give us an output node from our render for just the diffuse colors. Now, let me show you this render again really quick and mention something that's probably worth explaining. So the skin on this character is a combination of a diffuse shader and also it's actually the principled shader, sorry, and it has a diffuse color, and it also has subsurface scattering, which you can kind of see in the fingers and in the mouth and in the nose, that light penetrates it a little bit before it bounces back out and scatters, and that's what real skin does. It gives it kind of a nice look, but that's subsurface scattering. So I have to deal with that if I want to extract the color from this character. So I've got a subsurface section here, and that's the next thing I'm going to do. I'm going to extract the color from the subsurface scattering attributes of my shaders. I'm also going to go into Glossy, and I'm going to click on Direct. That's the output I want from Glossy. And finally, I also want an output for just the shadow information. So I'm going to check that box right there, Shadow. If you're not using any materials that use subsurface scattering, you can leave the subsurface line alone, but otherwise you need to have that. Okay, so we've basically got this view layer set up, and now I'm going to go up to my view layers here and create a new one. And here I'm going, you can now see all my reference drawing that I used when I created the character. here I'm going to rename my view layer into, and I'm just going to call it freestyle so that I can remember what it is. Okay, under these view layer settings, we need to treat it a little bit differently. So under our filters, we're going to uncheck everything except freestyle. So with this layer, we're just going to output those outlines so they can be treated separately from the rest of the render. I don't have to do anything with these. Under my freestyle line set, I'm going to create a line set, and the default name is just fine. And then down here under my line style, we'll play with these features and modifiers a little bit later to see if we can give these outlines sort of a hand-drawn quality. And finally, I'm also going to check denoising. That's generally a good idea. Oh, you know what? I probably don't need to check it on this layer. I think it's already checked. Let's check my other layer. View layer. It is. It's already checked on my other layer, so we're fine there. Okay, and so with that put together, now we can start creating a compositor node tree. So I'm going to split out my window here and open a compositor on the left here. I can delete all this stuff. That was a previous attempt that didn't work so well. And you can see now that this render layer is showing my view layer, my first view layer, and it has my image output, alpha output, depth, normal. I probably don't actually need a normal output. Let's uncheck that and simplify. It also has those options that we went through and checked: shadow, diffuse color, glossy direct, subsurface color, and we don't need to worry about the noisy image. But basically from here, what I need to do now is set up a node tree. And it's a little bit complicated, but I'll try to kind of explain what we're doing as we go through. So I'm going to start off, basically what I need to do in order to get a good toon shaded look is I'm going to split out my shadows, my midtones, and my highlights. So first of all, I'm going to add under color, Shift A, and add a mix node. And I'm going to change this into an add blending mode. And into this is going to be just for my shadows, my shadow information. So into this, I'm going to put my diffuse color, and I'll standardize by putting that on the bottom image node on each one of these. We're going to make several of these, one for shadows, one for highlights, one for midtones. And then I'll take my subsurface color and stick it into my second image input. Okay, and I'll duplicate this twice more and do the exact same thing. Diffuse into the bottom and subsurface into the top. We'll just kind of make a set of stairs here. Okay, and now I'm going to, for each of these, I'm going to make a brightness and contrast node so that each one I have control over how bright it is. And that's actually how I'm going to take my shadow information and affect the look of my shadows. How bright and how dim can they be? I can determine that in the compositor. And then sometimes brightness and contrast have an effect on saturation. Whoop, duplicated. I'm going to add a hue saturation value node for each one of these lines as well. And we'll get into what those do later. We'll start manipulating them after we can kind of see what we're doing. Okay, so from here, Basically, these things are going to need to mix. So I'm going to duplicate this one more time and change it back into just a mix node. And we'll go top to bottom, bottom to top. Duplicate again. And oh, sorry, I lost track there for a second. So this mix is now going to go into the mix here, and our highlights. Matter of fact, let's label these things just to be a little more clear. So I'm going to select these three nodes and press Ctrl J, and that'll kind of frame them up for me. If I tap in, I can give that frame a label. We'll call this highlights. Then the next three, Ctrl J, midtones. And then the bottom three here, Ctrl J, shadows. And I think, just to avoid visual confusion, I'm going to hold down Shift, right click and swipe through this noodle, and we'll just kind of bring it up over the top here so it's not quite so tangled. And just to be weird, I'm going to make my highlights and my midtones kind of representative shades there, and my shadows, of course, will be the darkest. Okay, highlights, midtones. That just gives us a little bit of organization, so you can see a little better what we're doing now. We're mixing our midtones and our shadows values together, and then we're mixing our highlights value with the result of that first mix. Okay, and then finally, we'll end up doing a third mix here because we're going to mix our original image back in. And that's going to go again top to bottom, bottom to top. Okay, so we're actually getting pretty close to the way things need to be here. Let's just align these so it's a little more obvious what's being mixed by what. At this point, we also need to duplicate our render layers, and instead of view layer, this second one's just going to be our layer called freestyle. And it's currently blank because I haven't rendered this out yet with these settings. But we're going to mix our freestyle lines back over everything after we mix all these values together. So we're going to do that with an alpha over. Whoop. And that's still under color, so we'll grab the alpha over node here, and we'll take our alpha value and put it in as our mix factor. This mix is going to go into our top image, and then we'll take our image, the image of our freestyle lines, and put it in the bottom of our alpha over here. Okay, and finally, that whole thing will mix back into our composite. Okay, so that's basically the node tree that we're setting up here. Hopefully that's, you know what, this is getting big enough. I'm just going to close out the 3D view and try to give you a better view of it. So if you're on YouTube watching, this would be a good time to pause and maybe duplicate this setup. It's not quite done. You'll notice these two mix nodes, they don't have anything plugged into the factor. This one we're actually just going to use the slider. But these first two mix nodes need a mix factor, and that's going to be a color ramp. So let's create a color ramp. That's found under Converter, Color Ramp. We'll create one color ramp for the second mix node, and one color ramp for the first mix node. Whoops. And we accidentally plugged it in there, which we didn't mean to do. All right. Let's just get these out of the way a little bit more. And I'm going to kind of try to organize these noodles just a little better. Okay. So our first color ramp is basically to determine, like, okay, this is the dividing line between midtones and shadows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these values kind of roughly around the middle, and we don't want a lot of gradients here, right? We want this thing to look sort of cel shaded. So we're going to put them pretty close together. We're going to take the image output from that and make it our mix factor for our first mix node. And that ought to give that a little bit more clarity. So our second color ramp is kind of to determine, okay, what's highlight and what's everything else we just mixed together. So we're going to take our white value clear down and our black value up just a little, and again put them pretty close together and take the image output of that and use it as our mix factor for our second mix node. Now these both have to have an input as well, or else they don't really do us a lot of good. So the input for the first color ramp is going to be our shadow output that we checked earlier. So basically we're just taking that output and we're giving it hard edges and determining where the cutoff should be with this color ramp. Okay, the second one, second mix node is going to be our glossy direct output. The second color ramp is going to have our glossy direct output as its factor. And again, that kind of does the same thing. It just hardens the edges and determines where that cutoff is. Okay, so now at this point we are actually ready to render. So let's see what this looks like, and then we can start mixing these values in real time. After our first render, it's not going to look proper yet, but let's have a look. Okay, and you can kind of see what's happened here. It looks just about normal, other than we have this freestyle stroke on top of the original render. And that's because we haven't really changed any of our values in our node editor. So let's kind of shrink this down. Matter of fact, let's split our window out. And let's have a look here at what happens when we change our compositing settings. So first of all, this mix factor right here, the last mix node that we put in, determines how much of our original image, this big arcing noodle here, how much of our original image is mixed in compared with our new cartoony image. And right now it's 1 to 0, a 1 to 0 ratio, so in favor of our original image. So if we start dialing that back, you can see that we start getting a little bit more of a toon shaded look. But if we dial it all the way down, we lose any highlights and any shadows. Well, that's because the values of our highlights and our shadows and midtones are all the same here with their brightness and contrast, their hue, saturation, and value. So we actually can determine those values right here. So let's go into our shadows and let's take the brightness down. And you can see what's happened here. Like that actually, it is working, but the saturation's gone crazy and that doesn't look very good. So that's why we have this saturation value here. And that looks a little bit better. And I also like to tweak with the value box within hue, saturation, and value. And that actually starts to look pretty cartoony. And you know, if I want to change where the shadows end and stop, you know, how much of the shadow data we're using, I can slide this color ramp around. We can dial it back a little, or we can dial it way forward and say, you know what, make the shadows a little more dominant. But I find a pretty good middle ground is usually looks pretty nice. So, okay, let's call that good for our shadows for now. Our midtones we're going to leave alone. We're just going to leave them at their default values, but we can tweak with them if we want through the same settings. And our highlights, we're actually going to increase our value on our highlights. We're going to brighten them up. And again, we're probably going to desaturate them a little bit, and that doesn't look very good. You've got to be pretty subtle with the highlights, or else they start looking bad really fast. So, as a matter of fact, I don't like how big they are. I'm going to dial them down even smaller. Okay. And we're going to way desaturate those and just bring them down. Matter of fact, seems like if we take the value of our white into a gray, it makes there be a little bit less of a difference between the two. We don't want it to be that stark, otherwise things look really shiny. If things start looking shiny, that's not usually a good thing. I think I'll take the value from my hue saturation value node all the way up on this. Just kind of play with the brightness from there. Okay, that's probably... Ooh, that actually really doesn't look very good. Let's take the saturation down even farther. Brightness up brighter. And really kind of tweak this back. There we go. We'll just kind of give ourselves a few little highlights there. Okay, now, to me, this kind of mix, like, while it starts to look very cartoony, let's put these closer together to get harder edges. There we go. It starts to look very cartoony. It doesn't look, to me, it looks a little bit too Adobe Illustrator-ish. So I like to come to this last mix node, and I like to bring the mix factor back to maybe about 25% of the original rendered image. And to me, that looks a lot better. You know, just a little bit of dimensionality to it as opposed to just being completely flat. You know, and you can decide how much of each you want. You can mix these together. The last thing that we can do here is we're going to go into our freestyle view layer, and we can play with the line style, because right now it's very uniform, very kind of computer generated. And we don't necessarily want that. So I'm going to go into the thickness, and I'm going to add a noise modifier. And this noise modifier, it's got an amplitude value and a period value, and the amplitude is basically going to be like how much zigzag are we putting into this thing. And I'm just going to put maybe like 1.5 to start, and the period value I'm going to increase, and that's basically how frequent are the zigs and zags. And so I'm going to put that up to like 50, because I don't want this to look like, you know, somebody like drew it during an earthquake. So one of the cool things about Blender is you can actually re-render render layers all by themselves. I don't have to re-render this entire image here. So the render layer node, it's got this little film strip down here, and that says I just want to re-render this one layer. So if I click on that, it's just going to take a few seconds to re-render our freestyle lines, and then it'll put it back on top of the other already rendered layer. Okay. So if you look at that now, those lines have a different quality to them, right? In places they're thick, and in some places they're thin, and they have a little bit of unevenness to them. I'm going to say I don't really like it yet. So I'll probably tweak with that a little bit more, but for the purposes of this tutorial, hopefully you can now understand kind of how that's done, how that's put together. So I'll continue to tweak with the line style, and I'll try to get something that's a little more hand drawn in look and not just kind of random line thickness. But that's how I achieve a cartoon, kind of hand-drawn cartoon look in Blender without actually having to go through and make every single one of my materials a Toon shaded material. I hope this is helpful, and I hope you have a good day.